I call it fantasy rock, which is a genre that kind of doesn't exist. So a lot of people are confused by it. But I think of it as in the early 70s and late 60s, all the like sort of pre-metal hard rock bands were just sort of making awesome blues influenced rock and roll, like hard rock, like your Sabbaths and Zeppelin and Uriah Heep and bands like that. And they were all kind of writing songs that vaguely flirted with like fantasy imagery, like Led Zeppelin was using Tolkien lyrics and Uriah Heep literally has an album called Demons and Wizards and just all that kind of stuff, songs about dragons and that kind of stuff, which just sort of seems like sort of cheesy, juvenile, dude subject matter. And it is, don't get me wrong. But like, I always loved that stuff. Because I loved fantasy growing up as a kid. I loved, Greek mythology and Norse mythology, tales of Hercules and stuff. And my favorite movie when I was a little kid was Jason and the Argonauts, the 1963 version with the like claymation skeletons at the end and the Hydra and Clash of the Titans with Release the Kraken and all that kind of stuff. So I loved all the kind of like classic high medieval fantasy tropes and stuff like that. And I love that all these sort of hard rock and early 70s concept albums always seem to kind of like flirt with that stuff a little bit. And then, I'm also a gamer, video games, fantasy novels, all that kind of stuff. So it's all that stuff comes very naturally to me. And to blend those ideas, I thought would be a fun kind of exercise. So, I mean, musically, it's basically just sort of psychedelic rock. And there's maybe a little bit of jam band, jazz stuff in there. Like I had a guy tell me he thought it sounded like Herbie Hancock. I was like, sick, love that.
I'll take it.
Yeah, but the songs are sort of basically just collections of riffs and if we're going to get real jazz school about it, you could say they're all just sort of like little modal mood pieces that kind of hang out in one key, and then there's solo explorations and stuff like that. But then the sort of high concept part of it came in piece, like looping all the pieces together thematically with like little interludes and stuff like that. So the whole album flows together like one long form piece of music. Like the Dark Side of the Moon, I think would be a great example. It's just a long form record. Everything's linked thematically. But if you actually listen to Dark Side of the Moon, most of the time they're just like hanging out on two chord jams. Like they're just sort of like musically it's not that complex, but they just present it as like this grand, long operatic form, like a big grand piece of music. And I love that approach. I love the idea that you could create this huge epic art form, but at the end of the day it's basically still just like two chord jams, which are my favorite things musically. So I had that idea. I had a whole bunch of riffs and stuff that didn't kind of fit into the regular verse chorus songwriting approach that I often employ. So I kind of looped them all together into this loose narrative that I had of the idea. I had these characters in mind. I had the idea of a heroic character called the Shepherd and a villainous character called the Wolf, and the idea that these two characters would have some kind of conflict. So I sort of wrote this loose fable involving these two characters, jammed out a bunch of ideas, and then I got my the dungeon master in my D&D campaign to come play some drums for me, and I got the bass player in my first ever bass band, or my first ever band, to come play some bass, and the three of us jammed out these ideas, and I filled in the rest of the gaps playing lots of keyboard and guitar. And we were like, let's just go full nerd, full fantasy, and try and tell it like an epic cycle through like psychedelic rock jams. And that was kind of the idea behind it.
That might be the best description of someone's music we've ever had. That was such a good intro into the album. So I actually am skipping ahead to notes because I had this written down. The whole album has a vision for the music, the lyrics, the sound, the production, the art. It's all one cohesive package, like Dark Side of the Moon. That was the example that I had. So we're on the same page. It doesn't seem like anything is just randomly thrown together. It seems like there's been a lot of thought behind everything. Like the album artwork ties into the lyrics and the characters and the sound and the production and the music videos and the card game and the map. Everything is the stroke of one genius that sees it all and fleshes it out in different forms. So that's like the highest praise that I can give, I think.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the idea was sort of you're not just making songs, you're making a world. You're making a world for the listener to get lost into, you know? And the idea that everything related to the album just creates more intricacies to get lost into, you know? Like I love it. Take like fantasy books. Like I read the George R. R. Martin Game of Thrones series as the show was coming out. I actually saw the show first, but then I was like, oh, I should check out these books. And I was like, oh, these are sick. And when you spend a lot of your life in a tour van, it's great to have a really long fantasy novel to get lost into. But what's great about those books is that they have the narrative, but they also have all these tertiary parts to the story that maybe are not super necessary to include for like the bulk narrative, but they make they're creating a world to get lost into. Like you have all these other families and other continents, and like just the idea that you're lost in this beautiful world that you can escape into is sort of part of the fun. So I tried to bring that approach to making the record, you know, like I've got the songs, and the songs are sort of the core narrative, the idea that the shepherd and the wolf, and they meet and they do battle, and it's good versus evil and man versus nature and blah blah blah. But also there's jams and there's fun extraneous stuff and cool grooves and mood pieces to get lost into. And then the album would have like a, you know, the gatefold when you open it up would have a map, you know, to get like lost in the world, and like a story, and the idea that you can just sort of like, I don't know, smoke a doobie and enter this world and just hang out in the world of the shepherd and the wolf for a while was kind of like my big dream, you know, like step into my lair, you know, that kind of thing.